Hedged, a thriller by S.L. Shelton, narrated by the author. Prologue. Chase Grant stood over his unconscious father. Asshole. The word, though whispered, sounded like a scream. He stared into his father's face, hoping to see some sign of movement, yet dreading it at the same time. What he had to say was best uttered without interruption, lest he lose his nerve. He sat in the chair next to the hospital bed, keeping his eyes locked on his father's face. He stared for several minutes before exhaling slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath. An apology would have been nice, Chase said, his voice low. If not to me, at least to Mom. It's too late for her now, too. No response. A tear burned a path down Chase's cheek before dropping off his chin to his lap. His father wouldn't survive the night. The cancer had come on too fast, or rather, his father had ignored the symptoms too long. By the time it was painful enough to go to the doctor, his lungs were eaten up with the murderous byproduct of a lifelong 2-pack-a-day smoking habit. I don't know what to say, Dad, Chase whispered. You weren't there when we needed you, and when you were beating the shit out of us. That's not fair, Chase thought. He never hit Mom. Chase shook his head and a hot tear rolled down his face. But you left her, you son of a bitch. You left us all. He watched his father's face, so pale, so weak. How could someone who had been so godlike, so all-powerful, end up a broken, sad pile of meat like this? It's not fair, is it? More tears slipped down his cheeks. He grabbed the corner of his jacket and wiped his face, clumsily, absently. You spent my whole life teaching me you were always right and I was always wrong, Chase said through a catch in his throat. How is it I learned family is everything and you didn't? He reached out to touch his father's hand with the intent of picking it up, but when the paper-thin skin felt cold to the touch, he withdrew and instead tucked his hands under his legs, preempting further temptation. He hadn't talked to his father in almost 2 years. He had given in to a moment of desperation and called the elder Grant for bail money. Then, like now, he got no response and no acknowledgement. But you always left us hanging, didn't you? And like now, he felt stupid for even trying to talk to his father. Words meant nothing. His last words to his father before tonight were spoken to silence on the other end of the phone nearly 2 years earlier. Coward. Chase hadn't known what that meant when he was a child, only that it was supposed to sting, though it never did. Nor did he understand why he insulted his father in that particular manner that night almost 2 years earlier, except that it had been a word that his father had bullied him with. It must have held some secret abusive power Chase wasn't aware of. Chin up, asshole. You were right. I know I'm a screw-up. Chase shook his head. He knew he suffered from serious character flaws, shoving people out of his life when they didn't seem to love unconditionally, and quickly resorting to physical violence when he or someone he loved was threatened. Occasionally, it had led to extreme violence. Violence. That was something Chase was good at. He chuckled through his tears. I wonder where I got that from. A bubbling breath caught in his father's throat, and he wheezed a weak cough. Chase froze, his heart jumping at the movement. But his father didn't wake. His breathing simply became louder. After a tense moment, holding his breath, Chase relaxed and leaned forward. I guess I should thank you, he whispered. You taught me better than anyone how to take a punch. Chase curled his fingers into a fist unconsciously. Of course, I had to learn on my own how to throw one, but hey, there's always a learning curve growing up, right? The rhythmic rattle of his father's breath made the conversation unsatisfying. He wondered if his sister, Chloe, had been right. Maybe it would have been better just to let the old man die and have it all behind them. But that seemed too easy, and nothing worthwhile was easy. In fact, nothing in Chase's life had ever been easy, so why start now? If it hadn't been for your constant need to beat me down, I wouldn't have worked so hard to prove you wrong. A particularly loud rasp in his father's throat seemed almost like a scoff of smug satisfaction. That's how it sounded to Chase's ears anyway. I make good money now. It's a good job. A legal job. Chase shrugged. It was a job that didn't involve calculating the spread on basketball series in his head on the fly. Chase was always good with numbers. Like little magic codes begging to reveal their secrets, numbers had always been Chase's friend. They winked at him, sharing their secrets effortlessly. While others saw stacks of numbers in chaotic and formless flows, he saw patterns, tricks, secrets. Numbers didn't lie. If they did, you weren't treating them right. Working for the bookie let the numbers man Chase had become pursue his natural talent with math. But he had changed all that and was earning an honest living now. The lack of acknowledgement from his father for that accomplishment angered him. He gritted his teeth, suddenly overwhelmed by the desire to punch his unconscious father in the face. "Coward, asshole," he whispered, then waited for the back of his father's hand. Chase wanted it. He wanted that fight, the brutality. He wanted an excuse to put a pillow over his father's face and choke out the last few moments of the life he had left. "Stop it. Just stop," Chase thought. "He's your father, bastard that he is. You protect family." Chase leaned forward. "I've done things. I've hurt people." No response. Not even a flicker of motion in his eyelids. "But I kept Chloe safe," he said, sitting straight and wiping his eyes again. "She's a good girl, smart, strong." Chase's cheek twitched, almost as if his body rejected the comfortable lie he told himself. Like Chase, Chloe had flaws that haunted her, and like Chase, her flaws had led her to dark, violent places. Unfortunately, she was usually on the receiving end of the violence she attracted, and unfortunately, it was usually Chase who stepped in to stop it. "Do you remember the night that I called you?" he asked, his voice low and full of accusation. "Chloe was in the hospital again." He shook his head, trying to remember the name of the guy who had hurt her. Eddie. That's it. Eddie was the guy's name. He listened to the oxygen hissing through his father's breathing tube. "I could have used your help that night. Chloe had 3 broken ribs by the time I got out of jail." He leaned forward again and whispered, "You can hear me, can't you?" No response. That night he had called his father for help. The night he'd called his father a coward and hung up after hearing no reply. It had been a wake-up call. Chase had realized he was alone. There would be no one out there to keep an eye on him or help him when he was in trouble. And worse, he had been so close to being sent away for a long time. He realized he'd never be able to protect Chloe if he were in prison. He shook his head, staring at his old man's face, angry that the tears were still falling. "I guess you think you did me a favor by not bailing me out that night," Chase said. "And maybe you did, but it didn't help Chloe. She suffered because I wasn't there. They did things to her." He had tried to clean up his life since then. He'd caught a lucky break. He hated relying on luck for anything, but he was grateful for it that night almost 2 years ago. A smart kid with a head for numbers, trying to make a living the best way he knew how. That's the way the police had seen it anyway, and that's how they presented it to the judge. Thank God they didn't know about the rest of it. One of the cops had actually vouched for him, Jimmy, the friendly cop. Jimmy had stepped in front of the judge and took responsibility for Chase's release. The judge set him free on the condition he'd move into the empty apartment next door to friendly cop Jimmy and get an honest job. Chase knew a gift when he saw it, and he wasn't going to do hard time working for someone else. Jimmy had given him a way out, an apartment of his own and honest work, though dishwasher was shit work for a numbers man. It was only a few months before he found his real calling, stock analyst, a legal numbers racket. He started out pimping small-cap penny stocks. Scams, hopeful startups, and did so well he was recruited to work at a small firm. He wore a tie to work now. He grinned at his father. Ain't that a kick in the teeth? A tie. Me. You taught me how to hate, old man, and Juvie taught me how to channel it, but I had to learn how to be a useful member of society on my own. He shrugged one shoulder up and wiped more tears on his arm. Fuck you for not being there for us. His words were barely intelligible, caught in his throat and pushed out through an increasing stream of tears. The conversation seemed to only deepen Chase's pain. Sudden awareness of the time crept up his spine. He knew this was taking too long. He looked over his shoulder, half expecting to see his father's second wife walk in. The last thing he wanted was to suffer her disapproving glare. He knew how they viewed Chase and Chloe. Screw-ups, losers, low class. That's why he had waited until she had left the room with her son before coming up to say goodbye to his father. His father's second wife got the best of him after the old man had grown up a bit. She had no right to cast judgment on the family who had been abandoned, allowing her to live her happy little life. Chase's family got the ruins of his father's first failed attempt at adulthood. His second wife got the benefit of those lessons, stealing him away when he got restless. He wiped his face on his sleeve and turned back to his father. After staring at the old man for a few minutes, Chase stood, slowly, purposefully, aware it would be the last time he would walk away from a conversation with his father, and the only time he would ever get the last word. No do-overs, Dad. Sorry, Chase said, as he leaned over to kiss his father goodbye. The faint smell of Old Spice wafted up, his father's iconic scent. A weak, raspy cough from deep in his father's chest startled him, precluding the kiss. Chase straightened abruptly and looked at his dad's face again, wondering if he were waking. Or maybe it was just that his dad needed to get the last word after all, even if it was just a phlegmy roll from his cancer-riddled chest. Chase turned to walk out, abandoning the last sentiment, but paused at the door and looked over his shoulder. Asshole. With the last word safely on Chase's scorecard, he left, turning down the hallway before there was any chance of his father denying him the win. At the end of the corridor, the elevator opened. His father's second wife and her son stepped off the lift, and Chase diverted quickly to the stairs before being seen. His stepbrother looked over his shoulder but didn't seem to notice Chase as he disappeared down the stairwell, the slow groaning of the closing door more likely the cause of the backward glance. Chase was halfway down the stairs to the ground floor when he began to regret his final words to his father. He paused on the landing, letting the insult echo in his mind. He looked back up the stairs, for an instant tempted to return and correct the situation, but the idea of standing in the room with Sarah and her son was more of a challenge than he could stomach. What difference does it make? He's not even awake. He continued to linger at the edge of the stairs, trapped by indecision. But are those what I want to remember as my last words to him? He shook his head as the tears started to flow again. He stood there, paralyzed by regret, until the door below him opened and two nurses walked toward him. He hastily wiped his eyes and continued down the stairs. As he passed the two women, one of them, a brown-skinned woman, maybe Middle Eastern or Indian, gave him a sideways glance, then reached out, touching him on the shoulder. The gesture had lasted only a second, breaking as they crossed, but it was a welcome warmth he hadn't expected. Penetrating. The comfort transmitted through that simple gesture followed him out of the hospital and down to the street where he'd parked. He got into the car, feeling not as lost as he had when he'd left the room. Leaning forward, he stared at the fifth-floor window for several seconds, looking at his stepmother's back. God, he hated calling her that. "Bye, Dad," he whispered. Wiping his tears once more, he started his car and drove away. He would be home by the time his father passed, and deep in a bag of weed by the time he was buried. He was done. Time had caught up to them both, with all past regrets still lingering. Opening and closing title music. The Complex by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. Incompetech.com. Hedged. Copyright by S.L. Shelton. All rights reserved.